Hey everyone, welcome back to my study. I want to engage a little bit with this book, Out of the Ashes, Rebuilding American Culture. And this is by a guy named Anthony Esolen, I think is how you say that. And this book is, just as it talks about, how do you rebuild a Christian culture in the United States. And it's part of a kind of a trend that you see among a lot of authors, particularly Roman Catholic authors. Esolen is Roman Catholic, and some Orthodox authors as well, about what needs to be done to rebuild and restore Western civilization. In the broad sense, Esolen's talking about American culture in particular. And Esolen is, as I say, he's a very conservative, traditionalist Roman Catholic. I think he's, I think it's fair to say he's more conservative and traditionalist than I am. He sometimes is very harsh in his descriptions of his ideological opponents, and very dire in his assessment of where we are as a culture. And perhaps I'd like to be a little softer and use a little bit more optimistic language at times. But I don't think, even if I would approach or talk about some of these things differently, I don't think that means he's wrong about everything he says. I think he makes some genuinely insightful observations, and I like the fact that, unlike some of these books that are kind of like society's going to hell in a handbasket, he actually offers some practical things that churches, families, communities can be doing to do our part to shore up Western civilization and American culture as a Christian culture. And so that's what I want to talk a little bit about here, and talk about his kind of 10 things. He has 10 chapters where he talks about different topics, and so I'll just go through what he says, or kind of what I took from what he says, my kind of digestion of what he says. And the very first one is tell the truth. And he says, don't use buzzwords, eschew political correctness. Just tell the truth. Be plain-speaking, truth-telling people. Or as Jesus might say, let your yes be yes and your no be no. And avoid jargon and that kind of thing. And I think that's probably why he comes across as so strident at times, because he's really committed to doing his part to tell the truth. And that sometimes for him means being quite blunt. I can appreciate that at times. I think it's also important to tell the truth in a way that people are going to be able to hear it and receive it. And so maybe that's an area where I differ a little bit in just in terms of style, but not in terms of aim. I think he's right. There is a lot of hype. There's a lot of fake news. There's a lot of straight up lying and massaging and manipulating of the facts in our culture. And we just need to recover plain spoken truth as something that's going to help cure some of what's ailing our society. Number 2, he says, read great literature and commit great poetry to memory. And I told my brother in August, I finally got around to making a New Year's resolution. I want to start memorizing more poetry, and actually have got one down, so I feel good about that. But I think it's Esolen who makes the observation that, you probably, unless you're a bazillionaire, you're not going to own a Leonardo painting or a Michelangelo sculpture, but you can take Shakespeare or some of the great masterworks of literature and actually possess it, actually memorize it, actually have it in your grasp all day long by memorizing great literature and great poetry. And I think there's something to that, something healthy and wholesome, but also challenging and rewarding and beautiful and life-giving about that. So I thought that was cool. And very closely connected to that, he talks about restoring beauty through great art, through all kinds of art he talks about. He mentions how we can do this in churches, in how we build churches if we have the opportunity in terms of architecture or renovations, in terms of furnishings and investments and all that. But he also talks about the music we use in churches. And I've heard other traditionalist Roman Catholics complain about the music that's used in the Mass, and I'm not really very familiar with that. I'm not Roman Catholic. But he does talk about using classical hymns and folk hymns and traditional, even he mentions the old revival hymns and everything as being kind of a higher standard of beauty than a lot of apparently what he thinks he's encountering. So being intentional about incorporating beauty and timeless beauty, and not just whatever the latest trend or fad is, into what we do in churches and families and homes and communities. Number 4, he talks about restoring primary education. Children who are in the primary school age range, he says, ought to be learning language arts, geography, history, and they ought to be learning about their faith as well. And some of that might happen. He's a big fan of classical schools. Some of that might happen in private schools. Some of that might happen in public schools, combined with the work that the parents are doing at home. And it really is, of course, the responsibility of parents at the end of the day to see to it that their children get a great education. And that might mean doing a lot to supplement whatever the official curriculum is, unless you're homeschooling, I guess. But restore primary education and make sure kids have that solid foundation that they really need in language arts, geography, history, and faith, and basic math skills, reading, writing, arithmetic, right? And then following from that, number 5, he talks about restoring higher education. And he says people in higher ed should study the classics with teachers who love them. And Christians who are working for the restoration of a genuinely Christian culture and restoring Western civilization ought to be supporting classical colleges. And this is kind of a growing edge in higher ed right now. There are more of these classical colleges popping up, more great books programs that are kind of getting attention these days, and that's a good development, and we should support it however we can. Talking it up, encouraging students to attend these schools or go through these programs or study with these professors. If we know even at a school that it's not a classical school or a great book school, but there are certain professors who really just love the classics and really help their students to share in that love. We ought to be pointing people to those professors to restore higher education. Then he talks in the next 2 chapters about restoring manhood or masculinity, and then restoring or elevating womanhood. And he talks about a lot of things, some of which will probably be controversial in today's milieu and today's environment. But I think there are some things that pretty much any Bible-believing Christian could look at and say, yeah, that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. In terms of restoring manhood, giving to our children, especially our boys, but also our girls, visions of heroic manhood, of what a heroic masculinity could look like, and not just the kind of cynical or jaded or toxic masculinity or the anti-heroes that we get in our popular culture so often. We should restore rites of passage for boys as well as for girls. And we should not get overly worked up or about boys-only clubs. There's something healthy he talks about boys, and I'm a boy, and we had these, kind of informally on the playground, the boys-only, we're going to play this game or do this thing. And there's important things you learn through those single-sex clubs, both for boys and for girls, and he says we should encourage that as long as it's something that's happening in a healthy way and there's not bullying or whatever. He talks about scouting as a great example of that. We should celebrate strong fathers who are protectors and providers for their family and pious and helping their family learn to do their duties for God, and especially their children, obviously, for God and for their community. In terms of elevating womanhood, he talks about some of these same things, and he talks about celebrating motherhood. There's one thing in this world that women can do that men cannot, and it's also the most important thing in this world for the continuation of our species to continue to exist, and that's motherhood. And like a lot of people, he's kind of flabbergasted at how motherhood has been kind of denigrated in some circles, and that this is like not as important or not as big a deal as having a career or working for a company or something and making money. And he's like, think about that. Motherhood is awesome. It really is this awesome, wonderful gift, and we really ought to talk about that and celebrate that. And he also talks about, and this is something that you see kind of all across world literature, that women have a special role, and perhaps this is actually connected to motherhood and child rearing. Women have a special role in cultivating a home that is hospitable, in that kind of not just having a house or a roof over your head, but really having a home with its own culture and its own outreach to neighbors and inviting them in. And of course, men have a role to play in that as well. But he talks about how women have historically had a special role there. And he says, his wife is actually, I think, a medical doctor. He's not talking about women need to stay home and do housework or anything like that. That's not what he's arguing for. But just celebrating the gifts that women bring to the table, that bring other people to the table, and that there is something special about that. Number 8, he talks about go outside. Turn your screens off. Go be active. Go do something outside. Go do something just for the fun of it. Go fly a kite or hike a trail or just for the joy of the activity. Go play a game of pick up ball with people in your neighborhood, and not because you're gonna get anything from it or you're gonna turn it into a career or something, but just for the joy of it. So number 8 was go outside, be active. Number 9, support local clubs, local societies, organizations, charities. Support state and local governance. Get the church outside the walls into the community. And he talks about in the Roman Catholic background that he's coming from, having processions in the town or other outdoor masses or outdoor events like that, to be a visible part of your local community, and as individuals to do our part to elevate and to work for the flourishing of our communities. And finally, number 10, I think this is really important. Echoing Matthew chapter 6, he says, seek first the kingdom of God. He says, you don't restore civilization by making civilization or American culture, by making that your aim. You actually restore civilization by making the kingdom of God your aim, and giving your life over to God and doing the duties and the things that God calls you to do, following your vocation under God. Then you find that actually you have all these ideas and these energy to do these other things that work to restore communities, restore neighborhoods, restore whole civilization. So that's kind of my big takeaways from Anthony Esolen's book, Out of the Ashes, and it's I think got some good words for us here, and these 10 things that I've listed are I think the primary things there, and there's something on that list that I think all of us could work on and contribute to the revival and the renewal of a Christian society. All right, so I will leave it there and see you next time.